Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Stylistics for this week. And our topic is academic English. And today I'm going to teach you a little bit more about general academic English. Last week we did some punctuation work, but this time we're talking more about general style and stylistics for academic English. Now, academic English, it's probably one of the more difficult English to learn how to use, but I want to start by saying that the rules that I'm going to teach you today for academic English, you should take them in exactly the same way that you took the rules when I told you about speeches, when I taught you about poetry, and that is that these rules are not definite. You don't have to follow these rules to make a perfect piece of academic writing, but by knowing the rules, this can really help you to improve your piece of writing. Just as using a rhetorical question will improve your speech writing, using some of the techniques that you see here will also help to improve your writing. Okay, so we'll start with an amazing paper written by a man called Oppenheimer, which is called Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilized Irrespective of Necessity. Problems with using long words needlessly. Now, this is a kind of a parody paper which was published in several journals, in which he talked about the fact that academics are using extremely long words completely unnecessarily. So the first half and the second half of this title, they have exactly the same meaning. There is absolutely no reason to use these long words, and yet academics continue to use this extremely complicated vocabulary. Now, why do they do this? It's difficult to say somewhat. This kind of writing, it is clumsy, it is obscure, it's horrible to read. You have to read every sentence like 5 or 6 times. And even then, sometimes you can't understand what they are saying. I have an example over here on the left, which says, if and to the extent that constitutional patriotism can bind democratic citizens together, I argue, if and to the extent that it can create a civic identity based on liberal democratic principles, then it will define others of that identity, the illiberal and the anti-democratic, creating both a potential for aggressiveness towards those others and a strategic incentive for elites to exploit that potential. Now, did you understand that? No, me neither. Also, if you look at the verb choices here, which is I've highlighted in the text, you can see that how many active verbs has she used? Just one. I argue. The rest of them, she's got subjunctive mood, she's got conditionals, she has got gerunds, and she's got infinitive with to, and so on. She has used every single tense except for the simple tenses, which are easy to understand. And the effect of that is that this sentence goes on and on and on and on, and it's so difficult to connect the verbs to the nouns that basically it's like decoding a piece of code. It's really annoying to read. And then when people look at this writing, they say, why can't we make it simpler? And so on the right, I have some extracts from a Twitter thread where some academics were asked to summarize their PhDs using emojis. And these summaries, you can see, they are easy to understand. They communicate a simple idea without using complex vocabulary. So it must be possible for academics to write like this and not like this. So why don't they do it? Well, the question is, for an academic, are you writing to express an idea, or are you just writing to impress the reader? Now, this is actually not a simple question to answer, because if you ask any academic, they will say that the idea is to express an idea. I want to communicate my research to the general public or just to my academic peers. And so, you know, theoretically, you should be writing in a way that's understandable to as many people as possible, so as many people as possible will read your piece of writing. But it isn't that simple. To some extent, as a writer, you have to impress your reader. For example, if you would like to get your paper published in an academic journal, you have to go through the publishers and the people who will read your article and see if it's worth publishing. And if they see that, you know, you don't seem to have a very good academic vocabulary, maybe they will think this article is not worth publishing because the person who's writing doesn't have enough knowledge or enough academic experience. So these gatekeepers, to some extent, influence the language that you have to use if you're an academic writer. And even more than that, should I have to explain every single concept that I'm using in my piece of writing so that any layperson from the street can come and read my paper and understand it? Or am I just communicating with academics? Is there a problem with writing like this if I'm just talking to academics? Well, no, because we all understand the same language. Okay, it's not very nice language, but at least it's possible for academics to read. So, you know, a lot of people have some ideas about academic English, about how you can use academic English because your target audience can understand you, even though your target audience is quite a small group of academics. It's not really for the public. Okay, so a lot of people object to using complicated academic English. And here I have some quotes from some quite famous academics who are talking about the problems of academic English. The first one and the second one, they both say that academic English is used by people to make themselves seem more intelligent than they actually are. The more difficult and complex and opaque your writing is, the cleverer you are, essentially. And this is connected to quite an old idea. You know, in the Christian religion, it used to be illegal to translate the Bible into a normal spoken language, for example, into English. And this is because the idea was that the only people who were qualified to read the religious texts were people who had studied it all their life and thereby could read Latin. So that meant that they interpreted what was in the Bible and they would explain it to other people, and everyone else, they were too stupid to understand all of the concepts in the Bible. And if they were ever given a translation, they might read this text and then, you know, misinterpret it and get the wrong idea. So the idea of keeping a protected academic circle, which no one is allowed to come and, you know, take a paper and then misinterpret it and then go tell the world that they know something and they have research, even though they actually don't. They actually haven't understood the paper. So academic writers sometimes, I think, are trying to protect their writing from being read, essentially, because they are worried that people are going to misinterpret their ideas, and then that's going to cause problems for them. Okay. The third quote from a woman called Rachel Tor, she says that academic writers sometimes write in this way just to fit in with the general academic field, that it's not some sort of political ideology, but instead that, you know, everyone else is doing it, so you feel like you have to do it. You want to fit in, and so you use the same language as the people who are around you. And the next point says that academics are immersed in academic writing. So to you, it sounds like jargon, but to me, it's my everyday vocabulary. This is a big deal in teaching circles, that as a teacher, I read a lot of academic papers, And so I have all of this horrible academic vocabulary. But although it sounds like jargon to a layperson who comes in to read this piece of paper, to me it isn't jargon. To me, the word, communicative approach. The communicative approach probably doesn't mean a lot to other people, but to a teacher, not only is that basic teaching vocabulary, but also it communicates in 2 words what you would use 5 or 6 sentences to communicate otherwise. So although it sounds like jargon to you, to me, this is just everyday vocabulary. So in some ways, this influences academic writing and how difficult it is to read. If you read philosophical writing, for example, it uses a lot of weird vocabulary that it's taken from other pieces of philosophical writing. But the reason why it uses it is because it explains a really complicated concept in one word, like Heimat, or I don't know, Fremdschamung from Nietzsche. And other people use these words in their writing because Nietzsche wrote a whole book about what this means, and it's explained in one word. So if anyone is reading this, has any basic knowledge of philosophy, they will have already read that book. So they don't need the whole explanation. They just need the one piece of vocabulary. Now, the last one is the most serious accusation against academic writers, and that is that opaque writing obscures muddied thoughts. That is, you don't really know what your argument is, but if you write it in the most difficult way possible, then no one else is going to know what your argument is either. Which, I don't know if that's true about real writers, but when I was in university, when I was preparing this presentation, I looked back at some of my old university essays, and this last one, I'm 100% guilty of. Did I know the facts? No. Did I have a good argument? No. But what I did have was a really good vocabulary. So what I used to do is write in the most complicated, annoying way possible so that the professor wouldn't reread the paragraph to see that I didn't know what I was talking about, because it was too annoying and horrible to read. And so writing in a horrible academic style actually stops people from seeing that your argument is rubbish. They just see the words and they think, well, I don't know. They sound like they know what they're talking about. Okay, there's one more argument for academic writing, which is more of an excuse really than an argument, but it goes like this. Academic writers are not engaging writers. That's because they're not trained to be engaging, interesting writers. Being an engaging, interesting writer, that's the job of a writer. But academics, they are trained to make studies and do research and ponder philosophical concepts. To get things down on paper, that's just not what their skills are. So you can point the finger at them and saying you don't know anything and you're hiding it by using obscure language, or you're trying to stop people from reading your writing because you have this academic elite political circle and you don't want others to enter into your circle. But in the end, I think a lot of the reason why academic writing is so bad is because the academics are bad writers. And that's just a matter that's very, very difficult to solve, and it's unlikely to be solved anytime soon. All right. So we talked about bad academic writing and we've had a look at it, but if we want to write in a good way in academic writing, what can we do? Well, first, you need to be clear. Don't use every conditional ever in one sentence. Stay focused. Don't start going off on a tangent talking about something that happened in your life unless it's relevant. You should have evidence for everything that you say. So don't just claim that everyone in the world knows this fact. You should have someone who has done the research and their research has been looked at by others and they all agree that this is now a solid fact. But you have to have a quote from someone else to show that this is true. You also need to have a good structure for your academic writing. So every argument should follow the next argument. You should have an introduction. You should have a conclusion. It should be easy to see what you're trying to explain. The point of this academic writing is to help others to understand something that you know or that you've learned. Now, about the style, it should be pretty formal, so don't use contractions, don't use slang, but you don't have to use really long sentences. You don't have to use extreme thesaurus vocabulary. Remember from the first quote, sometimes a $5 word will do. You don't need the $500 word. Okay, now the last point is about every different subject discipline having different conventions. So when I was in university, I studied a very general degree, which meant I was in a lot of different departments. I was in the political department, and I was in the literature department, and I was in the linguistics department, and every different department had their own idea about how someone should write an essay. But the good news is for you that if you enter into a course, the first thing they're going to teach you is what their conventions are for writing an essay. So they'll say, please have this many words in your introduction and conclusion. Please have this many paragraphs. Please use first person or third person. Please only use the passive. Please write dates precisely using the day, the month, the year, or please only write dates using the year. And all of this, even about formatting, italics and bold and so on, they will teach you from the beginning. So depending on what discipline you have, you're going to have different rules, but there are some rules which apply to all disciplines and all academic writing. So we're going to have a look at that, but before we do that, I'm going to give you a bit of a translation exercise. And we've gone back to this piece of writing about constitutional patriotism again. So bearing in mind the instructions from the previous slide to keep it simple, use tenses, be clear, concise, and communicate what the person is saying, I'd like you to have a look at this paragraph and try and translate it into a clearer, more understandable style. So if you would, please pause the video and spend about 5 minutes trying to translate this piece of writing for me. All right, so I'll check your answers later on the Google Classroom. We're going to move on now to imagining your first proper piece of academic writing. So academic writing is not the same as writing an essay in an English classroom, because, you know, how long does it take you to write 2,000 words, right? How long does it take me? An hour, 2 hours to write 2,000 words? But that's not a proper piece of academic writing, right? Because a piece of academic writing should be crafted. It shouldn't just be a flow from your brain to the pen and, you know, filling in the word count as fast as you can. So you need to consider an academic essay to be more than just a piece of English language writing. So step one, your teacher, your professor, your tutor is going to give you a question. And your job is to interpret the question and see what they want you to write. So the best thing when you're looking at your question is first to see what the command word is. Usually these command words, they tell you what to do. For example, explain, describe, compare, compare and contrast, discuss, outline, illustrate. All of these command verbs, they tell you what kind of essay you're going to have to write. So I've got a couple of examples here, and I'll go through them and I'll explain what you need to do. The first one says, account for the differences between EFL textbooks written for university students in China and in Egypt. This is a real essay I have to write. So if it says account for, this means give an explanation for. So if you just looked at this question just from the beginning, you should think, I don't have to just write a list of differences between the textbooks. I need to explain the differences between the two textbooks. So when I'm writing my essay, I should probably have one sentence for a difference, and then 10 sentences for an explanation. Or possibly just explanations and then a difference, something like that. The second one is assess the impact of the removal of EFL from China's National University Entrance Examination of Chinese EFL students' IELTS scores between 2018 and 2020. Now, looking at this question, the first thing you can see is it's very, very, very precise. Most good professors will give you extremely precise questions, and that is because the world of academic research is so huge, and you would really have to be reading forever if you weren't looking at a very specific time in a specific place with a specific event. So if you see the command verb to assess, assessing the impact means seeing if the impact was small or seeing if it was big. So you could list things that had happened, or you could just look very specifically at the changes in IELTS scores and say if they are big or small, if they are significant or insignificant in comparison to other changes in IELTS scores over time. Okay, the next one, compare Kazakh students' attitudes towards teacher-focused and student-focused teaching styles in the university EFL classroom. Compare, 1, 2. Give a comparison between two things. So don't just describe one half and then that's the end of the essay. You need to give a comparison between two things. The next one is illustrate. If it asks you to illustrate something, usually it's asking for you to give real-world concrete examples of something. So illustrate the impact of the internet on teaching styles. This means you have to give examples or maybe anecdotes about how the teaching styles have changed due to the internet. The next one is discuss. Discuss usually means examine in detail. So describe the event and look at every single part of the event and see it in detail. That's discuss. And the last one is outline. If it asks you to outline something, it doesn't want you to explain. It only wants you to write a short summary. So as much as you can, avoid trying to give explanations or reasons for things, just give a short summary. Don't give your opinion, don't give any other outside information, just a quick summary outline of these things. There's actually a lot more command verbs in this, but these are just the one I chose to illustrate different types of exam question. Right, so sometimes, because your teacher thinks that they are clever, they don't use command words because, you know, for stylistic reasons, sometimes do this sounds a little bit overbearing. So they don't use command verbs, and it makes the job of interpreting the question a lot more difficult. So if you have a look at this one, electoral procedures differ between New Zealand and Australia. Discuss. If you see the word differ, that probably means you have to compare and contrast, like say the differences between New Zealand and Australia. The next one. Are they really having this effect? This means you need to assess it, really, the impact. Look at the evidence. Is it really having an impact? Yes or no? So look at the evidence. Okay, next one. So this is saying the cause of the problems in the New Zealand health system is caused by politics, social reasons, and economic reasons. So you're looking at the causes, the reasons, and the effect is the pressure. So this should be a cause and effect type of essay. If you actually search on the internet often, it gives you a good structure for writing any specific type of essay. So when you start your essay, you should start with a thesis statement. A thesis statement, it very quickly describes what you're going to argue, because all essays really start with introduction, and then the body, and then the conclusion. And the old saying goes, you start by telling them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them what you want to tell them, and then you tell them what you've told them. Essentially, the thesis statement is telling the audience, telling the reader what you're going to tell them. So you start by directly answering the question that you've been given. Next, in the same sentence, you give a quick summary of all of the 3 or 4 reasons that you're going to give for answering the question. And then, oh, right, that's all. When you are writing this sentence, you should be short, brief, specific. Don't give too many examples. Don't give quotes already in the first paragraph. Start by just specifically outlining what your argument is going to be in the essay. So I've done an example for you. If the question is, why are mobile phones banned in so many school classrooms? This is an essay where you have to list reasons mostly. So my thesis statement goes like this. Mobile phones are banned in school classrooms because, I'm answering the question, because of 3 main reasons. They distract the student, they facilitate cheating, and they disrupt the lesson as a whole. This is parallelism as well, haha. Okay, so we're answering the question and we're outlining the main arguments that we're going to use throughout the whole essay. We're not theorizing already, we're not giving concrete examples, we're just giving what we're going to argue. Okay, so after we've done the thesis statement, we have to plan our essay. Now, if you're writing an hour before the essay is due, a lot of the time you don't really have time to plan, but planning your essay really helps you to keep on topic, keep your topic sentences in order, and it makes you actually think about what your argument is going to be. So personally, I do write outlines before I write the essay, but usually I plan each paragraph with a question. So number 1, how do they distract the student? Number 2, how do they encourage cheating? Number 3, how do they distract the whole lesson? I would write questions to structure the essay, but if you just want to write a quick summary, that's fine too. I've got 2 different essays, which I've just given you a quick plan of how to plan your essay. For example, the first one, why are mobile phones banned in so many school classrooms? We start with introduction, which is the thesis statement. Mobile phones are banned in school classrooms because blah, 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 blah. Next, the main body. Point 1, because they distract the student. The evidence for this, well, a lot of times you can get an experiment that someone's already done on the internet. Like they've given a student a task. One of them had to scroll down on a phone at the same time as doing the task, and the other one wasn't allowed to use a phone. Or one person had a phone in their pocket and the other person didn't, something like that. You can actually get evidence for a lot of claims about any concept. So it's a good idea for you to search either on Google or JSTOR or any kind of academic website, and you can often get papers that prove the thing that you're about to say. So point 1, distracts the student. Evidence, evidence, evidence. New paragraph. Point 2, evidence, 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 evidence. Okay, if you want, you can then include a counter argument. Some people say, mobile phones, some people say that students are not distracted by mobile phones, as evidenced in this paper, where someone gave classes using mobile phones as a teaching tool, and this was successful as evidence in this paper. And then you say, however, students are often not only using their phones for doing the exercises, but also to browse Instagram, as evidenced in this paper. And then you give a conclusion, and that's the end of your essay. I have another one, which is comparing and contrasting. You can have 2 different ways of using a compare and contrast essay. So in my opinion, the first way is the worst. In the first one, you do 1, 2, 3 from Newton, and then you say, on the other hand, Einstein is different, 1, 2, 3, and then a conclusion. But my personal favorite way is to do it the second way. In the second way, you've got Newton said this, but Einstein said this. Newton said this, but Einstein said this. Newton said this, and Einstein said this. All in all, the 3 different things were blah, 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 blah. And that's what you do in your conclusion. You summarize the 3 things that you've said previously in the above paragraphs. In the conclusion, you should not be introducing any new ideas. In the conclusion, you should not be using any more quotes. You should not be trying to interpret the data. You should be doing all the interpreting in the body paragraph. The conclusion is just to tell them what you've told them already. Okay, so that's our structure. Next, you're going to do some structures, I think. Yes. So here I have 3 essay topics. I would like you to choose one of these 3 essay topics, and then I would like you to, number 1, write a thesis sentence, and then number 2, quickly outline what the structure of your essay would look like. So paragraph 1 topic, or paragraph 1 question to answer, something like that. Okay, so you can get on with that, and then we're going to move on to the last part. When you're writing for the teacher to read it. What's your teacher looking for in your writing? Number 1, they need to see that your writing has been planned and focused, that you are actually answering the question, you're writing the right kind of essay, you're not just explaining where you should be comparing, things like that. And also, you should demonstrate that you understand the subject. So if you use a weird example that doesn't actually answer the question, I just think he doesn't understand the question, or he doesn't understand the answer, or he doesn't understand the example, and he doesn't understand anything. So you lose marks if you don't answer the question directly with every single point in your whole essay. Number 2, structure, coherent, logical order. If I can read it from beginning to end and understand your argument, that's in a logical order. If I'm reading this and I go, what? And then I go like this, and then I go like this, it's a bad essay. Next one, you have to use evidence. Now, I think Chris has done a lesson on using evidence and not just copying from the internet and not giving any sources or quotes. If you use evidence, that's even better than using your own original ideas, because it shows you've done the reading. If you've done the reading, it means you understand the whole concept, because if you haven't done the reading and you're pretending that these ideas are original, what it makes me just think is that you don't really know anything, and probably you just read the Wikipedia and you're pretending you know the whole subject area, which is why it's much better to use evidence and resources. And it's also because anyone who's reading your paper and they see an interesting fact or an interesting statement, they want to find out where you got that from, because if they can read that, they might want to read the whole paper that someone else has done. For example, students are distracted by mobile phones. But like, that's your opinion, and I want to have a quote, so I can read this quote and I can go, oh, I want to see that study. So then I go to that study and I read that one as well. Your paper is part of a network of a lot of academic English, and it's all referencing each other, because if it's all referencing each other, then more or less we all agree that it's all true, which is more or less the point of academic writing. And finally, there is some marks for style in academic writing. You should be using the same tense throughout, and the same either first person or third person or passive all the way throughout. It should be a balanced essay. So if it's compare and contrast, you should have about the same amount of one and the same amount of the other. You shouldn't write loads about this and like a tiny paragraph about this. And it also needs to be objective. So it's not just stating a long opinion, it's actually you know, looking at both sides of the argument, and it's evidence and balanced and fair. Okay. So a tiny bit of stylistic advice for writing an essay. The first one, when you are expressing your ideas, your research, something that you have learned, you should be explicit in what, where, who, how many, how much. So instead of saying we studied the homework of 10 students over a number of years, you should say 10 students over 5 years. Don't say several, say a number. Don't say most of them, say an exact percentage. Don't say a while ago, say in 2006. Don't say 5% of the participants, you should say 5% of 300 participants. You should be extremely specific because it's important to be specific because in your opinion, most of is 70%, but in my opinion, most of is 80%. So I misinterpret your writing immediately because you haven't been specific with your data. Also in an essay, don't use very. Very, awfully, really, very much. These adverbs make it sound like you're not being objective and you're not being specific. Like the students were very distracted by their phones. That's not an argument. You could say you need to give evidence. You can't just give your opinion. Like phones are very bad in the classroom. Are they? How much bad? You have to give like some kind of measure, and that's really your opinion. Okay. What else? Also, finally, the one is about being consistent. So it's perfectly appropriate to go to your professor and say, Professor, can I say I think, I found, I discovered, or should I be using passive voice? It was found, it was discovered. A lot of the time, when you're writing in university, the only audience is going to be your professor. So it's kind of acceptable to just write for the professor. So if your professor says, you can only use passive voice, you can say, oh, but that's bad academic writing and it makes it more difficult to understand. But really, she's going to have to read it. So you say, oh, yes, professor, anything you say. That's a sad fact about writing in university. I used to have a professor who would say incredible statements in history lessons. He would say, oh, the history of Europe is the history of 5 great men. And so whenever I wrote my essay, I wrote the history of Europe is the history of 5 great men. The history of World War II is the history of 3 great men. And I'm writing for him, so basically I just write what he wants to hear. Okay. So one final practice. Here I have a very unspecific, vague, very subjective piece of writing about a cow experiment. In the last activity, I would like you to take this cow experiment and make it more objective. You can make up your own facts or make up your own numbers, but please change this piece of writing to make it objective and a better piece of writing altogether. For example, in the first sentence, in this experiment, I tried feeding several cows lots of different grasses. Here you should say, I tried feeding 30 cows 3 different types of grasses. 10 cows ate 1 type of grass. Okay, so try and make it a bit more specific. And that's all for today. Those are your 3 exercises, and I hope you will send them to me in Google Classroom. I wish you a lovely quarantine, but now I've got to go to another lesson. So, goodbye, everyone.